Okay, so if I run from the colours, top right, white, lamp black, ultramarine blue, burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, Windsor red, Windsor yellow, Naples yellow and white. And I'm just going to make up a very dark colour. I'm using alkyd oils, so I'm going to use some black, ultramarine blue, burnt umber. And this is just going to be the base colour for the dark markings on the feathers. So you can see my canvas is taped to my board. Just a rigid board top right, and I've just taped it because I just generally paint on rolled canvas rather than stretch canvas. So that underpainting or the undertone that I talked about is a burnt umber acrylic, and I've just toned the canvas with that. And you can also see that the back of my palette, my glass palette, is also toned roughly the same colour, and I do that just for ease of colour selection and colour mixing. And you can see a YouTube video I've got up showing myself actually building one of those very easy glass palettes, super easy to clean as well. So that canvas acrylic layer had dried, and then on top of that I just put a little bit of white transfer paper, and then on top of that was my reference image, and I've just traced through it, and I just got that on there really quickly rather than spending a couple of hours actually drawing it on there. And the feathers obviously are quite complicated as well. So after that transfer was done on there, I needed to seal it. Otherwise, when I was applying anything like oil paint, it would just wipe those marks off straight away. And I sealed it with some Winsor & Newton pastel and pencil permanent fixative, as I mentioned, and that dries really quick. It only takes just 1 or 2 minutes to dry, and when it's touch dry I just start the oil painting. And I'm using alkyd oils as I usually do, and that's just because they dry so much quicker than standard oils, but they don't dry as quick as acrylic, so it actually stays open and gives me enough time to do a bit of blending as well. Now as you can see, I'm just blocking in those darks, the underlayer of the dark markings, and I'm going to have to build those layers up. And throughout this video I'm going to actually have to speed the process up as well, because this painting, even though it's quite small, took around about 1.5 hours or so to complete. So when I'm just doing the same thing over and over, like here I'm blocking in, I'm just going to speed it up, and then I'll slow it right down when I think there's some more valuable details or some more details that you should see. So I've just slowed it back down. So I'm going to make that lighter colour now, the actual white feather or the lighter feather colour. And I'm just washing out a new brush, just put a little bit of odorless paint thinners on the palette just to allow the colours to flow a little bit easier. I'm not using any mediums, no alkyd mediums, no liquid, nothing at all. The only medium I'm using, or using as a medium, is just some odorless paint thinners. Now that lighter colour is quite a greeny colour as well, it's quite surprising, but I'm actually going to paint it a little bit creamier, because that's the actual colour I saw on the Lana Falcon myself in real life, and the photo reference is not exactly as I remembered it. So I'm just going to match those colours up a little bit, but I'm going to actually go a little bit creamier, so a little bit more Naples yellow I'm going to add to it. So I'm just checking my brush against the colour, just to see if I'm getting close. It's not critical to be spot on unless you're painting a duck painting that's going into one of those stamp type of competitions where you need to have every feather correct and the colour spot on. I'm just going for the general overall appearance, and I really just want to show you the techniques I'm going to use to paint this quite complicated feather structure. So the darks are in, and now I'm going to start to lay in those lighter colours. You can see how I'm checking the brush against the colour just to see if it's close by. And another way of doing that is to laminate your reference photograph, have that by your painting, and then when it's laminated you can actually touch the paint onto the surface to see how close you are getting. And of course, because it'll be laminated, you could just use some kitchen tissue and just wipe the paint straight off then. And that's especially useful and handy for beginners when they are starting to mix colours, to assess the colours, and also for more advanced, because sometimes the colours that you're seeing on the palette and canvas are not that easy to judge. So I'm just speeding it all back up again now, because I'm just going to put that very similar colour onto all those lighter areas. Just warming the colour up a little bit there for that sunlit area. I'm using a flat brush. I think it was a number 2 bristle brush, and that's what I generally use for blocking in colours. And now going back in with another dark mix, because as you can see on the painting, you can still see quite a lot of the tonal canvas through this paint. So I'm just going a bit darker. Everything is still wet at this stage. Now I could have allowed it to dry overnight, and then it would have been easier to have painted on top. But I wanted to do as much as I could in one session. And then once I've done that, I will allow it to dry overnight, just so I can get some real opaqueness to the paints. So I'm just working in the darkest of the darks. I'm angling my brush to more easily allow me to make the marks that I'm seeing on the reference photo. And I'm just going to block in all these dark areas again. And you can see, even though the canvas is wet, that these are going much more opaque. Now I could have tackled this in a few different ways. I could have actually done this darker areas in the acrylic underpainting stage, or I could have actually, with the oils, painted the whole area very dark and then gone in with the lighter tones. But this way is much more similar to the way I would tackle fur, and that's in layers generally. So you can see I'm putting that next layer on, the darks, and then I'm going in with the lighter colours as well, brushing in that feather direction just as I would with fur. Is this very similar technique, using the straight flat brush with a chiseled edge on its side, just very lightly doing the strokes. Now even though I put quite thick paint on, you can still see on the left hand side in particular, you can still see that undertone through the dark feather markings. So I know I'm going to have to do another layer, and I'm going to allow this to dry overnight once I finish this session, so I can build those layers up again. And when you're painting wet in wet, you see second layers, you can get a light tone over a dark as I'm doing there, but you do need to use a lighter stroke. Plenty of paint on the brush. It needs to be thin enough to flow off the brush, but not so thin that it actually starts running or blurring on the canvas. If I want a more distinctive mark, you can see I'm pushing that a little bit harder. And I'm checking that reference just for the general shape as well. So I'm not just going on autopilot and putting these brush strokes in any way. I just feel like I'm looking at that reference. And for those of you that have seen my other videos, can really appreciate how similar this type of feather is to painting fur. If we had, perhaps if we was looking at the wing feathers, it would be obviously a much stiffer feather, then I'd use a different technique there. So I'm just going to continue adding these lighter tones over the whole canvas where required. Right, just going to put in a few of the lighter lights now, and they are a little bit bluer, so I've just added a little bit more ultramarine blue. I'm going to thin this down a little bit with odorless thinners as well. And just checking that colour. I know I want to go a little bit creamier, but I want it quite similar to the reference. So I'm just checking that colour against the reference before applying it to the canvas. It's not applying easily, so a little bit more odorless paint thinners. And when I'm adding a little bit of paint thinners, I do mean a little amount. I'm just putting the very tips of the bristles into the a little bowl I have with just about a tablespoon of thinners in it, if that, and just dipping it in, tapping it off so it is just a very small amount on the bristles themselves. The last thing I want is for it to be too thin, because then it would take quite a bit of paint to thicken it back up. I'm being much more careful with my strokes now. I'm assessing where they need to go before I apply them. And I also know areas are going to be applied overlaid as well. I'm going to apply more layers, so I'm not too concerned if the edges look a little bit raggedy and things like that. I know I'm going to start to bring some darks over the lights as well at later stages. Just painting that leading edge of the wing in. And because that's a bit lighter, it's helping to create the depth of the darks, which will be under the base of the wing. And just putting in suggestions of this. So I'm just continuing with those lighter areas now. Darkening and greening up that bottom section just slightly, and that's caused from the bounced light where the bird was standing on grass. So that's sun is beating down on the grass and bouncing that greeny yellow light back up into the feathers. And now just darkening those areas one more time and refining the shape as well now. So I've allowed the painting to dry overnight, and once again I've made up a dark mix, and now you can see really how much more opaque it is on the canvas. It's really having much more of a greater covering capacity now, so I can really get to work on those darks. And also adding a little bit of blue and white as well, just for that lighter area of the feathers. So you can see I'm now starting to really refine the colours and shapes. And also starting to refine those lighter feather areas as well. Yeah, I've made up a much lighter mix ready to put on the highlight where I can start overlapping the darker areas. Now I'm not going to glaze this painting at all, but perhaps if it was a commission or something like that, I really wanted to increase the details, I would then do the glazing and I could glaze the shadow areas and things like that and get it much more realistic looking. But for this demo I really wanted to stay away from complicating it as much as possible, so I'm not glazing at all. And I've just switched to a quite large rigger brush. So a rigger is a round brush, but it's very long haze, named after painting riggers in boat paintings and ship paintings, things like that, with the rigging ropes. But it's just as well suited to painting fine haze, whiskers, feathers and things like that. So I'm using that where I'm now going to overlap the fine edges of the feathers, where you can see each individual tiny little strand of feather. Obviously you don't have to go to this much detail in a painting, but usually in my demonstrations I like to make them quite detailed, so that it's up, once you've seen how detailed I can go, it's then up to you if you want to stop at an earlier stage, so you're not missing out on anything. If I put in quite a lot of detail, you at least get to see how that would be achieved. So I've really greened and yellowed that mix up to get that bounce light really showing up much more on those bottom feather areas. Now this rigger brush really only works if you get the paint consistency correct. If it's too thick, the paint will just not flow off the brush at all, and if it's too thin you'll find it'll start running down the palette, and also the marks that you're applying to the canvas will not hold this shape, so they'll start to flood out really and blur, and that's if you've applied too much thinners. So I'm just going to carry on adding these fine markings now over the whole of the canvas, just defining the shape of the feather edges. And also into this lighter area. I've moved to start painting on the opposite side as it's easier to pull the brush strokes towards you. But for the purpose of the videos, I try to stay out the way as much as possible, so I'm not always angling my body at a natural angle for myself. And now I've gone in with some darker mixes, putting in the central line of the feather, and also starting to take some of the darks over the light areas too. So I'm overlapping the dark over the light. And that's also helping now to form the shape of the feather. And I'm also using these darks now to cut into the lighter areas on this part of the wing, so I'm using the dark to redefine the shape of those feathers. I'm just going over the whole of the canvas now, just refining areas, just getting those colours and tones, the lightness and the darkness a little bit more accurate. And really that means punching up the lights and also the darks as well. So I'm getting much more contrast into the areas now. And just creating that chiseled edge on the brush again, and that's going to allow me to get some really fine tiny little feather marks. And it's much easier to do that with a chiseled edge rather than a rounded edge on the brush. I'm just putting in those final marks now, just refining the shapes even more. Now, as I said, this has taken me probably about an hour and a quarter or something like that to get to this stage. Now, there comes a stage as well when you think, is that enough? Do I need to stop now or keep going? And I could actually refine this a lot more, but it's all according to the level of realism you really want. And what I wanted to show you really for this demonstration was the techniques. Obviously this painting is not a finished painting as such, it's not going to be sold or anything like that, it's just purely a practice piece and to show you the techniques of painting very detailed feathers in this manner. I'm just using a flat brush again, and that's just creating the shape now, so with the little bits of highlight and the sky is reflected into the feather and things like that, just creating the shape and form now of the feathers as I'm putting the finishing touches to it. And lots of people ask, when do they know, or when do I know when I'm ready to stop, when should I finish a painting? And generally, when I can't see any more errors, no glaring mistakes or anything like that, that's when I generally finish a painting myself. And I'm just going to put just a couple more touches here and there. And I think I'm at that stage with this painting, and I am going to call it finished as well. Just a few more refining areas. Just have a general look over the whole painting. I'm much happier with that creamier tone. That's much more like the bird I saw in real life. And I think I'll call that done. If you're looking for more art resources, I've really got you covered. I've got a dedicated tutorial website, that's jasonmorgan.co.uk. Lots of videos on there, ebook tutorials, you name it, it's on that site. I've got a Patreon art channel. So every month I put up brand new videos, and that could be pastel videos, oils, charcoals, they're full-length videos, and there's also photo references with the Easy Trace line art on there. I've got quite a few hundred people supporting me, and that's on Patreon. And also, if you're after even more reference photos, I got a dedicated website just packed with reference photos. I think there's about 900 on there at the moment. So that's wildlifeart-online.com. Now please, with my YouTube channel, new videos coming on here as well. If you can possibly subscribe to the channel, then you're never going to miss out on new videos.